Today's daf is daf mem. It's trying to finish the parak, but we left off on daf lamed tes amid beis after the Mishnah, and the Gemara says Tnida lahad de Torah Rabbanon. So we have a brisa that interprets our Mishnah. Yoshev Yisrael b'tzad edro shalovdei kachom v'ovkachom cholev lo umevi lo v'erechoshesh. The Jew doesn't have to actually see the milking of the cow in order to guarantee that the idolater did not mix in non-kosher meat. All he has to do is he has to stand somewhere alongside. Hechidami, how would he know whether the guy is mixing pig's milk? You might say that there's no animal in the flock of the idol worshiper that is a non-kosher animal. So then pshita. So why do I need this brisa to tell me, that the Israel is out there supervising? Forget about supervising. There's no possibility of an add mixture of non-kosher milk. If there is a non-kosher, is amai. So why is it enough that the Yisrael is sitting outside? So the Gemara is going to now introduce the concept, which is very big in Hilchas Kashrus, which is called mirtas. Li'olam de'ika davar tami, he has a non-kosher animal in his herd. V'chikai chazile, if the Jew is sitting in a sitting position, that if he would stand, he would see and be able to supervise the milking of the cow. But when he sits, he's at a distance, he can't see. He can only see him when he stands up. His Ma'odetema might have thought came of the Yosef lo chazile. Maybe the guy, in those few minutes that the Jew is sitting, he'll sneak in and mix in some non-kosher milk. And therefore, Kamash Malon, the Bryce wants to teach me that if and when the Jew will stand up, he'll be able to see the milking of the cow. Irtas, mirtas. That's the famous principle of mirtas, which is relevant in many, many different halachas in Hilchas Kashrus, where we believe a professional like a chef or whatever who says that there's no taste of milk in the meat and so forth because he's afraid if he gets caught he'll lose his job. Lo ma'aribe, therefore we don't have to even suspect that the guy in that case will mix in non-kosher meat. Vadvash, the Mishnah says that you're allowed to get dvash from the idol worshiper. Dvash lo'ay nechel. Why did the Mishnah have to tell me that you're allowed to buy honey from an idolater? If you're worried about the possibility that the idolater mixes yayin, which is yayin nesach, into the honey, sorry, he would never do such a thing because wine spoils the honey. If you're worried about the fact that maybe he turned on the fire, this guy, underneath the pot of honey, and therefore be bishalakum nechal kamosh. You can eat honey without cooking it. So if it can be edible raw, then there's no bishalakum. Maybe you're worried about the fact that the kli, the utensil which the guy is using to prepare the dvash, is bolua. It is totally saturated with machol sasuros. And the Gemara is going to answer, of course, no sing tam lifgam mutter, since we paskin that no sing tam after 24 hours, the tam pogum is not oser, and therefore there's no problem with the honey. The Mishnah says dav divanios afal pishim enatvos. Now here we get into a little bit about machshirin, which is a major branch of the halachas of Tumah V'Tara, and that's when any one of the 7 liquids falls on top of a foodstuff, it makes the food susceptible to Kabbalah's Tumah. But here the Mishnah says the exception is that when you have clusters of grapes and there's some juice from the grapes that's dripping out, and let's say it falls onto a foodstuff, then ein bohem mishum hechsher mashke. It doesn't have the din of being machshir the foodstuff for Kabbalah's Tumah. The Gemara says, Reminu, we have a different price that says habotza lagas. So he's harvesting grapes for purpose of making the grapes into wine. That's called legas. Is here we have machlokes Beit Shammai and Hillel, but Hillel later on admits that he accepts the principle of Shammai. Shammai Omer Huchshar. You see that there's a chashivus, a certain significance to that juice that oozes out from the grapes, and it's machshir, something to be makabel tuma. Hillel Omer Lo Huchshar. It's not significant, and therefore it doesn't make a foodstuff susceptible to tuma. And Odile Hillel Shammai. Later on, Hillel turns around and rescinds his original position in order to accept the position of Shammai. So you see clearly that the juice that comes out of the grapes is a mashke that's machshir l'kabel tuma. How could our Mishnah say the opposite? And the Gemara answers, Hasam kaboyle l'mashke, hacha kaboyle lo boyle l'mashke. It all depends whether or not there was an interest on the part of the owner and he had das. Right? The Gemara says in Bab Metzia and Perikel Metzia that you need kiyite and dumya de kiyutan. Ma kiyite bedas, af kiyute bedas. As far as the dew that falls from the heavens on the food stuff, does the Bailam want the dew there? The moisture is beneficial for him or not? Here too. If he wants these drippings from the grapes, and he's going to gather them together and make a grape juice out of it and sell it on the market, then that's chashivas. That means he really has ratzon for the drippings to come out of the grapes. But if, on the other hand, he doesn't have any intention whatsoever of selling grape juice, then there's no chashivas to that drippings, and it's not machshir l'kabel tuma. That's our Mishnah. Now we have the sugya of taurus. Okay, taurus is a kind of a fish that is usually chopped up into smaller pieces. But if it's eina trufa, the Mishnah says that if it hasn't been cut by a knife, well, we'll see about the status of a knife, but then the Mishnah will allow you to eat that taurus, and more important, the tzir of the taurus. Tzir means there's a kind of a brine from the liquids that ooze out of the fish, and inside that brine, if you find something called a kilbis, which is a kosher fish, then you assume that he did not mix in non-kosher fish. Tana Rabbanu, we learned in the Brisa Ezi Taurus, she'ena trufa. What's the case of a taurus that's not cut up into pieces? At what point do you say, well, if it's not cut up into pieces, then I don't have to worry about a kashrus issue and about an admixture of non-kosher fish? And the Brisa establishes the following standard. Kol sherosh v'shidra nikar. In other words, if it was minced, then you have a problem. You won't be able to identify whether it's a kosher fish or not. But if the head, now I'm going to add another word here, but that's only going to one opinion in the Gemara, and the shidra is nikar, meaning you need two simonim from this piece of fish to establish that it's a kosher fish. You need both a thick head, the fish has a thick, wide head, and number two, it has a spine. And this is all nikar. You see it when you look at the fish. You know, therefore, that it's a kosher fish. Ezi tir sheyesh ba daga. And when do you say that there's brine that has this kosher fish, which is called kilbis, inside the brine, and therefore you're allowed to eat it? Kol she kilbis achas oshtei kilbios. Either one of these kosher fish called kilbis or two of them. And now we start today's daf. So the Gemara says, Shototelspo, you see that in the brine, these fish are sort of like swimming on top of the brine. So the Gemara asks right away, on this brisa. Hashta kilbus achas amar shari. Stay kilpios me boy. Why did you have to bother telling me one or two kilbios is enough to be matir? Because once there's a kilbis inside, he doesn't mix in a non-kosher fish. Tell me about one, and I certainly know if he has two of them, he has a twin pair of kilbias of kosher fish. That certainly lo kasha kan v'psuchos kan v'stum. So this is a forerunner of the sugi that we're going to learn about different kinds of barrels. There's a barrel which is open; it's left open, and a barrel which is closed. Now, in which case do we say that one single kilbis is not sufficient, but rather we need two kilbis? And in which case do we say that one kilbis is sufficient? And that's a machlokes between Rashi and Tosfos. So we're going to interpret this Gemara based on Rashi. Rashi is going to say the following, that if you're dealing with psuchos, which are open barrels of brine, then you got a problem. Because since the barrel is open, it's very possible that this kilbis fell into the barrel. It wasn't originally in the barrel. The brine was not made together with the kilbis, but rather the kilbis came from the outside. But if you find two of them, then you can be sure that this is the way they made the brine, and therefore the brine is kosher. If, on the other hand, there's stumos, nothing came from the outside because the barrel is completely sealed, hermetically sealed, then if you have one kilbis, then that certainly is enough to establish the kashrus of this brine. That's how Rashi interprets. Now, Tosfos asks a whole barrage of questions here, and therefore he comes to the opposite conclusion. And if we get a chance, maybe we'll learn the Tosfos. Itmar. Now we get to the main issue for today. We spoke about the head of the fish is discernible, and the spine of the fish is discernible. Is it A plus B, or is it A or B? Rav Huna Amar, Ad shete rosh v'shidra nikar. You need A plus B. You need both simanim to prove and establish that this fish is kosher. You need the head and the spine. Rav Nachman Amar, on the other hand, O rosh, O shidra, one of the two. Either you have the head, that will prove that it's kosher fish, or you have the spine, which will prove that it's kosher fish. You don't need both. Masiv Rav Ukva bar Chama. Rav Ukva Chama has a Mishnah in Chulin, and he sees this Mishnah in Chulin as a kash on both shitos, whether it's Rav Huna or Rav Nachman. Why? Because ubedagim, the Mishnah asks, what are the simoni kashrus of fish? Kol sheyesh bo snapir v'kas keses. No mention here about the head of the fish, the narrow head of the fish, or the spine. Obviously, those are not definitive signs to establish kashrus. If so, if they were, then the Mishnah Chulin would have listed them as other simoni kashrus. However, some Rishonim learn that Masiv Rav Ukva bar Chama, he's asking a kasha dafka on Rav Nachman, who says that one of the two would be a simon kashrus, where the Mishnah says you need two simonim, you need both snapir and kaskeses. Omar Abaye, ki tanya hi bi'ara ufalmuda. Okay, these are special kinds of fish that are kosher fish, but they have heads that are similar to non-kosher fish. In other words, their head is very narrow, like a kosher fish. And therefore, says Abaye, the brisa, or shall we say the Mishnah, that doesn't list the shape of the head as a proof positive to definitively establish the kashrus of the fish, that's talking about a place where you could find ara and pulmuda, these kinds of species of fish, that although they have heads that are quite wide and not narrow, and therefore you would assume that it's a non-kosher fish, nevertheless they are kosher fish. And apparently the reverse is also true, that if you find a fish that has a narrow head, doesn't necessarily prove and establish that it's a kosher fish, because there may be non-kosher fish that exhibit the same simon. This whole machlokes between Rav Huna and Rav Nachman regarding the question of whether we need both the head and the spine or one or the other, that's only in a case where you want to use their brine. The Gemara calls it the tabel. Tibul means to dip something. So you don't really have the fish itself, the be'en, the guf ha-tag, but you have only the tzir. Aval begufon. But if we're talking about a case where you want to know whether you could eat the fish itself, not just to dip in its brine, divrei kol, even Rav Nachman would agree that osach tehei rosh v'shidra nikar. You need both the head and the spine. And apparently the Gemara is assuming here that there's a fundamental distinction between the tzir, the brine, which doesn't have the be'en, and the guf hadag. And with regard to the guf hadag, we have to be very careful and to be machmir and require that we have two simonim here, both the head and the spine. Omer of Zara. Initially, my minig was that I dipped in the brine of Taris that I got from the idol worshiper, and I relied on the fact that there was one sign, either the rush or the spine. But came into Shamini Lahadi Amar Rabbi Yehuda Mishvei to Ula once I heard this statement that there's a machlokes really only litabel b'tziron, but aval gufan if you want to eat the fish itself, not the brine. Tivya kol also ad sheyeh rosh v'shidra nikar. Even Rav Nachman would agree that you need two simanim, both the head and the spine. Is then now I realize how chomer it is, and that in truth, as far as the fish itself, we're not going to rely on one simon. Is therefore betzira nami lo mitbali. I'm going to go one step further. I'm going to be machmir on myself and take the strict position that unless I have both the head and the spine discernible, I'm not even going to use the brine of the fish. Amar Papa Hilchasa, the Gemara is going to challenge this statement of Rav Papa. Achie rosh v'shidra nika kol shel achas v'yachas. Every single fish, you don't have the right to assume that since you found one fish that's kosher in the bunch, then they're all kosher. No. Says Rav Papa, every individual fish has to be established by these discernible simonim, and they have to have the simonim kashrus. And I'm going to deal and judge with every single fish. Meisvei, that's not so. What about the brayso that says chaticho sheyesh behem simon, bein bekulan, bein b'miktsason, v'afilu bi'echad mimea shebahen, kula mutaros? Meaning, if I buy from the idolater an entire bag full of fish, and I can establish that one fish in the bag, in the net, is kosher, then I'm allowed to eat the other 99 fish. So why are you telling me, Rav Papa, that every fish has to be established through its simonim as a kosher fish? So this guy, Sheigia, Shehevi, he brought garav. Garav is an entire barrel, shel chatichos of small pieces of fish. And they were able to establish the simon kashrus in one fish from the entire barrel. The heater of Shimon Gamliel's hagar of kula, and Rav Shimon Gamliel was matir eating all the fish as long as it's one fish that we know is kosher. We don't have to have definitive simon for every single fish, and that's against Rav Papa. And the Gemara answers to defend Rav Papa. To Gemara Papa, b'kshachatichos shavos. When you cut up a fish, then it's like a puzzle, and each piece of the cut up fish could fit into the next one and the one to its left right until you finally get the whole fish. So therefore, we know that since we could put together the entire puzzle of this fish, that if we could find one that's kosher, then the whole thing is kosher. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, if that be the case, then we're talking, according to Rav Shimon Gamliel, about a case where he could match the pieces together. So what's the big deal? Why do we have to repeat Rav Shimon Gamliel's brilliant psak as if it was a major landmark discovery that you could eat the fish? I mean, what else would it be? I mean, if you know it's kosher and you have all the pieces, then you might say that, you know what? Fish don't have that distinction. Sometimes you get two fish from two different pieces and you could put them together, they fit together. Mashal and Bryce says, no, we don't have to be concerned for the possibility that the fish came from somewhere else and we were able to put it all together like a puzzle. Hahu Arva. Arva is a boat. This we know from Cheskes Habatim. Did Sachanta. Now we said that Sachanta is something called chilik, I think. The osil is sichra. Okay, it came to a place called sichra, and the boat was filled with sachanta. Nofak Rabbi Yehuda ben Chinina v'chazad avikalfi v'shari. He went out to the boat, and Rav Huna saw scales. Now, scales means automatically that it has fins. So even if you didn't see fins, scales prove that there were fins, and therefore he permitted the fish. Amalei Rav didn't allow it. Why? Okay, maybe in general, if you don't know otherwise, then under normal conditions, you could assume that all the fish have scales, and the very fact that they have scales means they are kosher fish. That's in general. And that's called lo shchichi kalfi. But what about a place where the shchichi kalfi? Now, kalfi are the scales. And there are some non-kosher fish that have something, I'm not sure if it's exactly scales, but it's something similar to scales. And therefore, nofik shipure the shofar, when you have an important ruling of a horas din, then you go out and you blow the shofars to notify the public to Rav Yasar. And Rav Papa prohibited. So Rava prohibited, because Rava had his disciples, they accepted his psak, and they went out and they blew the shofar to notify the people that it's awesome. But Shipuri the Rav Huna bar Chinina, however, those who went out to blow the shofar for Rav Huna, they went out for Shari and they were martyred. So what exactly is the machlokas here? First of all, we have to know that as a general rule, once one of the chachamim paskins that it's also, you can't be martyred. And Rava made the announcement prohibiting the fish, and that came before Rav Huna. So how could Rav Huna then abolish the announcement of Rava? Says the Ramban that Rav Huna's announcement was made first. Or alternatively, where Rav Huna bar Chinina had already ruled that the fish were kosher, and only afterwards Rava disagreed and forbade it. Now, Rava's chumrah is very interesting. You may recall that this was a shipload, a boat that came in at Sichra, and it had suchanta, which is a kosher fish that has scales. But there were other fish on the boat, and maybe the scales sort of like rubbed off one fish onto the other. And how could you know for sure that every single fish is kosher? To Rav Asid. Omar Av Yirmiyah Bidifti, you know what? I don't even think that it's fair to assume that Rav Huna mattered eating all the fish on the boat. The Didi Amali Rav Papi told me personally, Kishor Rav Huna, that's only Betziron. He was more makil in terms of the tzir, the brine, the liquid, the drippings. But Begufan Lo, as far as the fish itself is concerned, when you're dealing with an Isur Doraisa, this is a Be'en, this is the real McCoy Isur, then even Rav Huna would have to agree that you can't be matter all the fish on the boat. There are non-kosher fish on the boat. Rav Ashi disagrees. So the Amali Rav Papa, not Rav Papi, Kishar Rav Huna Bar Chinana Filu Begufan, that in fact Rav Huna was matter even the fish themselves. Vanon lo misar nasana. And I don't prohibit it because I got this transmission that according to Rav Huna, even the fish themselves are mutter. And I'm not going to be choshesh that maybe there were non-kosher fish that got the scales sort of like by osmosis, and they rubbed off the scales on them. The Ka'amali Rav Papa told me about Rav Huna Bar Chinana that he permitted the fish themselves. So I'm inclined to, to be matter even the fish themselves, but I'm not going to prohibit it. V'lo Mishrael treat it, but I'm not even going to permit it. Why? Rav Huna only is matir in the case of the tzir, but not in the case of the gufa fish. Al the gufa divrei kol ache rosho v'shidra nikar kolecha v'yechad. So the Gemara doesn't seem to come to any definite conclusion. Rav Ashi seems to refrain from permitting the fish itself. He only permits the brine. But it's possible that he means to refrain from permitting even the brine. That's according to one shita. Yosef Rav Chinino bar Idi kamid Rav Avoda bar. Yosef v'kamar. Ove kochom shehevi areva mulei chavios. So there's a boat. Areva is a small boat as opposed to Arva is a larger ship. And the Akum brings in this boat barrels and barrels of tzir, of brine. Then it says kilbase be'achas man. We opened up one of the barrels and we found the kilbase, which is a kosher fish. Psuchos, kulamutaros, stumos, he muteros kulan asuros. As we said before, according to Rashi's sheet at least, if these are psuchos, then you have to worry about the fact that since the barrels are open, maybe the fish came from the outside, and even though you found a kosher fish inside the barrel, that doesn't really prove that all this brine comes from kosher fish. But stumos, if the barrels are locked or sealed, then we don't believe that any fish came from the outside. And if we found the kilbis inside the barrel, then we can assume that all of the fish inside are mutaros. Amalei, so Rav Ada says to Rav Chanina, Minolacha, from when do you know this law? And he says, Mitlasa Kroi Shmile. I heard it from 3 psukim. I learned it from 3 biblical sources. Meirav, Shmuel, Rabbi Yochanan. And each one of these 3 great Amoraim was matir, in the case of stumos, or even the psuchos, they were matir the stuma. And it's like I'm relying on 3 biblical psukim. That's how sure I am if I got a ruling, lakula, permission from Rav, Shmuel, and Rabbi Yochanan. Amarav Bruna Amara Kirve Dogim V'Ubaran. We used to call this when I was a kid caviar. The little babies of the fish. So we're talking about Kirve Dogim, right? That's the kishkis of the fish, the innards of the fish, and ubrin, which in fancy English we call the caviar, they call it roe, R-O-E, is any kochin element of mumcha. Mumcha here, in this context, doesn't mean an expert. It means a reliable Talmud Chacham who knows the halach. He knows when it's mutter, when it's aser. And we're not going to eat from these fish, the innards of the fish, unless we have an expert meaning a Talmid Chacham, a Mumche, who's going to testify that these are kosher fish, and he can identify the kosher species. It seems like back in the time of the Gemara, there was a lot of hanky-panky going on. There were a lot of people who were unscrupulous that they sold off non-kosher fish as if it was kosher. But this guy is a mumcha, so he's very scrupulous. We can rely on him to identify the fish. Ramile Ula. Also, Ula said, wait a minute, I have a contradiction to you, Rav Dostai. Why? Midakama Rav, Kirve, Dogim, V'ubrim, Eini Kochen Element of Mumcha, Michal Dedag Tome, Islay Ubar. Whoa. I don't get it. We found the roe, we found the ubar, right? That itself should be proof positive that the fish is kosher because we have a statement of Rav that kirvei dog ubar einin kocher element of mumcha, and that implies that a dog tummy has an ubar rinui, dog tummy, mashritz, dog tar, matil beitzim. In other words, only a kosher fish will produce eggs. And if you found the eggs, then you know it's a kosher fish. So why do you tell me that if it's a non-kosher fish, the ubar is also? There is no such mitzias. You can't have a reality of a non-kosher fish that has an ubar. And therefore, sami mikan ubrin, we're forced to reformulate the statement of Rav, in which Rav says that even for Ubrin to allow you to eat the roe, you need a mumcha who paskins that it came from a kosher fish. No, Rav never required for fish roe that you have to buy it from someone who paskins with definitive knowledge to identify the kosher fish. We know that non-kosher fish do not produce eggs. But in terms of the biology, the Gemara has another approach. Omalei Reb Zera. Reb Zera says, no, lo tistam. Don't erase it. I can tell you why Rav requires that mumcha to establish that this roe is from a kosher fish. Because travayu, whether or not it is kosher fish or non-kosher fish, matili beitzim, they both produce eggs. The kosher fish sends out the eggs to outside its body. The non-kosher fish will bring forth its young inside its body. So even though a non-kosher fish bears live young, as we saw in the Brisa, they are hatched from eggs inside the mother fish. Rav therefore ruled that fish roe may be brought only from an expert. Because the fact that you bought this fish roe, you don't know whether it was mashrish mibifnim, and therefore it is non-kosher, or it was mashrish bachutz, and therefore it's a kosher fish. Gemara says, "Lomali mumcha, why do I need to livdok b'simanim?" Right? Now, let's figure this out. Even roe have simanim. Now, they don't have scale. They don't have scales and fins, that's for sure. But they have something called simone beitzim. Meaning when you look at an egg and you want to know if it's a kosher egg or not kosher egg, there's certain simonim. And those simonim apply even to the ubrin of fish. So therefore, we have to examine and see if the eggs of the fish have the same simonim as eggs in general. The sanya kisimoni beitzim kach simoni dogim. Gemara says, what are you talking about? Simoni dogim salke daita? Do you really mean this seriously, that the signs of a fish are like the signs of an egg? Simoni dogim are snapir v'kaskeses. The Torah says explicitly, and he fins and scales. Those don't apply to eggs. You can't say that the eggs and the fish have the same simonim. Ella kisimone beitzim kach simone ubrei dog. So the ubrei dogim, the roe of the fish, has the same simonim like an egg. What are the simonim of an egg? Elim simoni beitzim kol shekoderes va'agulgeles. All right, it narrows and the sides are round. Rosha echad had one head of the egg, one end of the egg is flat. For Rosha echad chad, the other egg is not kad, flat, but rather sharp, pointed, tahor. Okay, so in order to be machshir an egg and assume it's a kosher egg, you have to know that one of its ends is flat, the other end is pointed. Shnei Roshei chadim, if it's pointed on both ends, Shnei Roshem chadim, or it's flat on both ends, Tmei, you know it's a non-kosher egg. Another simon is chelmon mi bachutz, vechelbon mi bifnim tmei, but chelbon mi bachutz, vechelbon mi bifnim tar. So it all depends upon whether the albumin is on the outside, the yolk is on the inside, or the other way around. Chelbon v'chemo robin zebezeh, if the albumin and the yolk are mixed together, zui beitzas hasheretz. That's a non-kosher egg that comes from a non-kosher bird. So now let's go back and say, how does this help us with the roe of a fish? Apparently, the Brisa holds that the roe of the kosher fish is shaped like the kosher bird's egg, which means it's flat on one side and pointed on the other side. So why does Rav say that we need a mumcha to supervise and identify? We have the simanim. We know it from Beitzim. And the simanim of the ubrei dogim are equal to the simanim of Beitzim. Omar Rava Kishini Mochu. You're looking at the roe after it was disfigured. And once it was disfigured, then you can't begin to tell me whether it's flat on one side, sharp on the other, or not. So therefore, you need an expert who can rely upon us. We'll rely upon him to tell us that the roe came from a kosher fish. So Gemara asks the following kash: Ulu Rav Tostoi to bin biri di Omar sami mikan ubrin. Right, he was saying that non-kosher fish don't produce eggs at all.